Okay then, guys, why not get started? Now it's 2:30, so thanks again, everybody, for being here, for attending, and for focusing in your first couple of weeks here as we get into the spring semester. Um, Today we have another interesting lecture lined up on the topic of the philosophy of religion. We're just going to kind of start by reviewing all the information we covered last time, and then we'll move on with the next piece. We have a new argument for God's existence that we want to try and start talking about today. And so that'll be the plan, to get into the cosmological argument and to add that to our notes on top of and beyond the ontological argument. So feel free if you can. I just want to make sure that you're active right now. Go ahead, say hello in the chat or however you want. Hi there. Hello, Andrea, Angel, Karen, Grace, Justin, Jan, Mary John, thank you. Andrea, Anthony, Madison, Kiwi, Jimena, Samuel, Isaac, Jeremy, Haddon, G, Dustin. Good to see you guys. So thank you so much for staying engaged and sticking with everything. All right. Let me go ahead then and just start with a couple of summary statements about what we did last time. One thing I'm doing here with my phone, just as I have a backup stream. 1 second on that. Okay, cool. So yeah, let me go ahead then and try my best to summarize some of the major information. And if I ask a few, little questions as we go along, some of you guys can help me fill in some of the gaps. All right, so to this point, we've been looking at the philosophy of religion. That's our first major topic in the course. And in the philosophy of religion, we pursue questions concerning arguments about the existence of God, criticisms of those arguments, what is the nature of God, what is the rationality of religious belief, and things like that. So the first major argument for God's existence that we've all been looking at has been the ontological argument. And this is an argument which seeks to prove that God exists without using any empirical evidence. It's not using any kind of physical evidence that you could observe with your senses. Instead, it's just based on ideas and concepts alone. Side note, the word ontological has ontos as a root in it, and that is from Greek, having to do with being. So it's really like an argument sort of that is based on the nature of what kind of being God is believed to be. Okay, so when Anselm, the classical writer from the 11th century, when St. Anselm starts off, he says, okay, let's get one thing established. What is the nature of God? What kind of being is God believed to be? And who can tell me just that point real fast? Like he says, everyone, can say that God is thought to be which being, which kind, what type? The overall definition that he's running with in this argument. Yes, the greatest conceivable being, perfect. And as we discussed it here in our meeting, we kind of talked about some common attributes that are usually thought of when we think of God, like that he's all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, and all-present, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipresent. And so what those qualities amount to overall is that he's the greatest conceivable being. At least that's the definition of the idea of God. So now the question is this greatest conceivable being real? Or is it just a made-up thing like, dragons or leprechauns or the tooth fairy? So what next Anselm says is that there are some things that only exist in the mind. On the other hand, there are things that exist in the mind and in reality. And we gave examples of both, like I was just saying, like things that only exist in the mind. Dragons, the X-Men, leprechauns, unicorns, mermaids. And then there are things that exist in the mind and in reality, like any one of us, Cal State Fullerton, the campus, the Statue of Liberty, the Great Wall of China. So there's all kinds of things that exist in the mind and in reality too. And the simple point he's trying to make is that it's greater for something to exist in both the mind and in reality. So if God's definition is greatest conceivable being, it wouldn't work if he was only in the mind, because that's not as great as something could possibly be imagined to be. So if we assume that God only exists in the mind, it's like saying that the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being, which he says is a contradiction. And therefore, since it's greater to exist in both, and God is defined by all people as the greatest conceivable being, he'd have to exist in both, which implies that he's actually real and not just an imaginary thing. And then there's this second point. Maybe someone can remember this point. He says on top of this that he has to exist in the mind and in reality to be the greatest conceivable being. He also what? He could not what? Let me see if anyone can write out that little tongue twister or say it, whatever. God cannot be what? Cannot be thought not to exist. Yes, Isaac. He can't be thought to not exist. Why? Once again, he goes back to that reasoning. He says, well, if something can be thought not to exist, then it's not as great as something which could never be thought of as non-existent. And since God's definition is greatest conceivable being, this implies that he's in that category of things that couldn't be thought not to exist. Actually, I shouldn't say category, because according to Anselm, God's the one and only thing that could be never thought not to exist. So God can't be thought not to exist because he's the greatest conceivable being. And if he could be thought not to exist, this would be something less than perfect. Finally, then, the last point he makes is this. So if God cannot be thought to not exist, then what's going on with atheists? Don't they say they don't think God exists? So how does he make sense of those apparent contradictions? He says nobody can think that God doesn't exist, but certainly we know there are people who call themselves atheists and they say they don't think God exists. So what does he go ahead and argue or say about such people or what their ideas are? How is it possible for there to be atheists then? What does he say? Just the last little recap question for you, and then we'll move on to a brief summary of some of the objections.
He says that the idea of God that they have in their mind is the wrong idea.
Perfect, exactly. Yeah, that they must be referring to something else, because the idea of God is one that's not compatible with being thought of as non-existent. So when people think there's no God, he believes that they're not really thinking of God, so that doesn't count, I guess, technically, as a thought that God does not exist. Okay, so good. Now, after that, we've talked about a trio of objections, and I'm just going to quickly summarize them really briefly. So one of them was from the monk named Gaunilo, and he lived at around the same time as Anselm. He was aware of Anselm's work, and his problem was that he didn't like, or find compelling anyway, Anselm's ontological argument. He did not think that it really could prove God exists. So he starts by just summarizing the argument. After that, he says, okay, here's the issue. You cannot conclude that something exists in reality just because you have an idea of it in your mind as a perfect, greatest conceivable being. And in order to make an example of what he's saying, he offers us an analogy to the definition of God. He refers to the lost island, which he describes as the greatest conceivable island. And so he says we can all think of such a concept and we can have it in our mind. But if somebody told you the island has to exist because existence is greater than not existing, and if it's the greatest conceivable island, then existence would have to be one of its qualities. He says that would be a ridiculous argument because obviously we know there's no such thing as the greatest conceivable island, and the lost island is just a made-up imaginary thing. So if the lost island is not proven to exist according to the same type of analysis as Anselm gives, then the argument when it's used to try and prove God's existence doesn't work either. And then there were two more critics that we went into at the end. So G.E. Moore, he was the next one. He's got a kind of unique reply to the Anselm argument. G.E. Moore, by the way, he lives in the 20th century, and so he's like a lot farther ahead, closer to our time. But anyway, he said, what does he say? He says existence isn't what? Quick question for you. According to G.E. Moore, the main point is that it's not a predicate. Okay, good. Now, who can tell me what the word predicate even refers to? A predicate, in other words, is what sort of thing?
It's like a verb, right?
It's an attribute to a subject.
It's kind of more like an adjective, but it could be a verb. It just depends. It's a quality or a feature of something that you associate with an object, with a subject. So, like if I say that Dr. Vulich is wearing a white sweater, then wearing a white sweater is the attribute that I have in that example. Or if I say the dog is brown, then being brown is the attribute that the dog is claimed to have in that sentence. So it's a quality or a feature, an attribute of something. And what Moore is saying is that existence, when you really think about it, it's not an attribute. And so that destroys Anselm's argument, because go back to Anselm again for a minute. Anselm said that, God's the greatest conceivable being, therefore he has to exist, because to exist is a quality that makes something greater than if it didn't have that quality. Like, I don't know, suppose you think that being tall is like a good feature for a person, whatever, I'm not saying that, but just suppose you believe that, then you would say tallness is a quality that makes a person better or greater than if they didn't have it. And so in the same way, Anselm offers us to think of existence as though it's an attribute, the having of which adds greatness. And Moore says this is all wrong because existence is not even an attribute. Now, I tried to make the point to you in a sort of common sense way, just by saying, think about it. If you were to describe something, no matter what it was, describe yourself on social media like a bio. I love, sports. I'm a huge fan of books. I like to go to concerts. I exist. I'm a Pisces, whatever. To say that you exist is just not a normal thing to point out in a list of descriptive features of anything. But his own way of putting the point is a slight more technical approach. So what he does is he asks us to consider two groupings of sentences. And they're very similar with one notable difference, that one of the groupings of sentences has a predicate inside. And in the other case, we swap out the predicate for the word exist. And what he thinks we would see and tries to show us is that by substituting the predicate with exist, we transform the sentence from one that's meaningful into one that's either meaningless or at least very confusing. So he uses these examples, tigers growl, and he divides the sentence into like 3 or 4 different varieties. All tigers growl, most tigers growl, some tigers do not growl. Now, whatever of those 4 sentences that you wanted to talk about, they all make clear sense. To say all tigers growl is clearly understandable, or to say most of them do, again, it clearly makes sense. But if I tell you most tigers exist, for example, replacing growl with exist there, now we have a sentence that's hard to understand, if at all. It sounds like it's saying more than half of the tigers exist, and there's a minority that don't. But there's no way to quantify the amount of things that do not exist. If we have a set of things, all of which exist, we can say how most of them have a feature that the minority of them don't. But if existence itself is the quality that we're trying to associate with the things, then there's no similar way to affect a coherent interpretation of the sentence. And the same goes with all exist, and of course the same goes with some do not exist. If it was some do not growl, it makes sense. Saying some do not exist is just a head scratcher. Like, what is that really saying? He says the only way to try and attach a meaning to such claims as these would be to say that when we talk about the non-existent tiger, we're talking about tigers from the world of fiction, fantasy, or just imagination, like Tony the Tiger or Tigger from Winnie the Pooh. But still, if that's the best way we can find a meaning for these sentences where existence is utilized, it's a far less standard and straightforward way of making meaningfulness out of it than if it had been a normal predicate. And so he rests his case. He thinks this demonstration showing us the 2 groups of sentences gives us the intuition that existence really does not work as a predicate. Okay, and then last, there was William Rowe. That's what we got to just at the end of the last meeting. So quickly, I'll summarize him. Rowe says the problem is you can't just define something as existing and then say, boom, done, that's proof. I just gave you the definition, and right there it says the thing exists. He believes that in the ontological argument, that's what the proponents of the argument have done. They just say God is defined as the existing perfect being, and so game over. If you say he doesn't exist, you're just talking nonsense, because that's saying the existing being doesn't exist. How can you say the being doesn't exist when existence is in the definition? Okay, Rowe says that's not right, and he tries to show us a counterexample. So he makes up 2 words, right? He makes up the word magican and magico. Magican is used to refer to like an existing magician, like say Houdini, David Blaine, David Copperfield, Chris Angel, or whatever, Penn and Teller, On the other hand, there's the magico, and that would be non-existing magicians. So that's like storybook magicians like Merlin. Some people, you guys talked about Gandalf, Harry Potter, Doctor Strange. Okay, so suppose that there had never been any existing magicians, though. Like, suppose that we lived in a different possible world where there wasn't Houdini and there wasn't, David Blaine, David Copperfield. In that circumstance, we still could have invented this word magican. We still could say that it means existing magician, but guess what? If that was so, there wouldn't be any, regardless of the meaning of the word and regardless of how it's defined. So even though there are magicians, there don't have to be just because we have this word. If they stop existing today, then they won't be back in the world tomorrow just because the word still exists. Now, last thing I want to say about Rowe, because I didn't get to mention this point, is like, okay, he gives that example that we just talked about, magican, magico. And it makes clear enough sense, but I've always noticed it's slightly confusing to some students because you have to think through that counterfactual step of the reasoning. You have to be like, okay, imagine a world where there's no magicians, but people still make up the word magican. And now we can see that in that case, there wouldn't be any such thing, even if the word had that definition. It's making sense, but it's a little bit of an extra step of reasoning. So I can make it a little clearer, I think, by just modifying his example slightly. So now I'm going to write down these two words, unican and unico. And in keeping with his example, what do you believe the word unican means? If anyone could guess. The word, the spelling, it's all a hint.
That it exists.
Yeah, it's a unicorn, Andrea or Jimena, but it's an existing unicorn, right? So that's what these are, existing unicorn. That's the definition. And so, of course, a unico would be then a what? Anybody? By parallel with the other example, unico.
Unicorn doesn't exist.
Yeah, the non-existing unicorn. Okay, good. Okay, now I'm going to walk us through this little example really briefly. We're going to start on this side for reasons that should be pretty obvious in a second here. So look, unicorns, we know they don't exist, but there have been a few that have been used in fiction, of course, and in film and all the rest. I don't know if there's a ton of names that are just like popping up in your mind, but does anybody know the name of a specific, non-existing unicorn from stories or from legends or anything like that? Any example at all? I mean, there are some, but let's see if you know one or two. Let me know, anybody. Unicorn, like that you've read about in stories? No, I mean, okay, so I know you're probably thinking, well, a unicorn is a type of fictional creature, but I can't point out a specific one. Okay, well, here's a few. So Charlie the Unicorn was like an internet meme a few years ago, maybe like a while back. It's a little bit maybe dated now already, but there was one such example. So there's Charlie. There's this movie, Jojo Rabbit or whatever. I never really saw it, but it's supposed to be a comedy that involves the character of Hitler of all things. And I believe there's like a unicorn in the film that pops up at various times. That's at least what some of my students have told me. I've not seen it, but I take it as given. So the Jojo unicorn is maybe another one. Let's see. You say in Adventure Time, I suppose so, but I don't know the reference yet. Maybe I'll hold off. So like in My Little Pony, if you guys know about this cartoon series, there is a unicorn involved. I forget, is it Rainbow Bright or is it Twilight Sparkle? One of them. The names escape me a little bit, but let's just say, Twilight Sparkle is another unicorn. And you know what's funny? I actually, a student last semester told me that there's a new one from anime or something. Is it Rainbow Dash? Okay, there you go. That's actually called Unico. But that might get a little confusing to list the name under this heading. Anyway, guys, point taken. There's plenty of, or at least some, fictional unicorns. Call them Unico if you wish. But can anything be put in this column? That's a new question. Can I list the name or identity of even one unican? Is that possible? It's a simple answer.
No.
Okay, no, we can't. And why not? Because they just don't exist. But hold on, doesn't the word unican mean existing unicorn? So here's Rowe's point. If something is defined as existing, fill in the blank, whatever, that doesn't prove that it has to exist. Because if it did, then I would have just proven to you right now, just by inventing this word, that there really are unicorns. But I can't do that. I can't show you that something exists just by making a word up, and according to the definition of the word, it exists. So even if unicorns exist according to the definition of the word unican, they don't really exist. And so now going back to the whole point about God, Rowe says that the ontological argument just simply defines God as an existing being. But that's not enough proof, because if God does not exist, suppose, then the word God is similar to unican. It means, according to its definition, the being exists. But if there's no such thing in the world, then the word does not refer to any real thing. Okay? So whether the example given was the author's original, which is magican, I think that mine's a little bit clearer, only because there's no such real unicorns. And in the other example, you have to think about how, although there is like David Copperfield, Harry Houdini, that they're not proven to have existed simply by the coining of the term. Okay, so just another subtle different look at the same material there. But now I guess we're good on that, and we're finally all right to move on, at least for the moment. You know, we won't forget these ideas, but we're moving on until further notice to a new argument for God's existence. Okay. Now, it's not that there's only one argument that God exists. The ontological argument is out there. It's been much discussed. You know, it's got a rich tradition, but there are other arguments that take a complete different approach to trying to prove the same thing, that God exists. And some of us may find favor with some of the arguments more than others. You know, you may be a person who says the ontological argument just didn't really work for me, or, you know, it just didn't hit for me in the way that I would have thought would convince me for some whatever reason. In my own mind, the ontological argument is interesting, but there are better arguments, and the one that we're going to learn now is what I argue, or what I think anyway, is probably the best, most sophisticated attempt to prove God's existence. So if I was out trying to show someone that God exists, or, you know, make the argument to them and appeal to their reason, I would probably rely mostly on this cosmological argument. To me, it's just my judgment. Everyone's got different views, but I feel that this one's quite persuasive only because it relies on widely shared intuitions about cause and effect, that everything which happens has to have a cause. And once that simple idea is held, the argument kind of makes sense. But there's much more detail that I'm going to have to reveal. So let's go through it step by step. So now we are learning about what's called the cosmological argument. Okay, the cosmological argument. Okay, now this is an ancient argument. This argument is thousands of years old. You can see writings that talk about this argument tracing way back to the era of the ancient Greeks. So we're talking about 400 years before the Common Era, before the life of Jesus Christ and all of that. You can see discussions of the cosmological argument in other world religions that go even further back than that, thousands of years behind that. So this is a quite deep and ancient argument that's been around for a long time, but it's been discussed and represented in like every new era. And we're looking at a version of it that was written about in the 20th century by this American philosopher named Richard Taylor. So I'm just going to put that here. So I just got to switch to that part of my notes. Yeah, so. All right, so the version of the argument that we're going to look at today is from this particular philosopher. His name is Richard Taylor, and he lived from 1919 until 2003. All right, Richard Taylor, and yeah, he taught at Brown University, Columbia, and the University of Rochester. And this discussion of the argument that we're reading comes from a book that was originally published in 1963. So his discussion of it is from 1963. But remember, as I told you, that he's not the first person to ever talk about the argument. It's not like he created it. He's just a commentator on it, and he's trying to make it make sense to a new generation of readers. Okay, so Richard Taylor, that's his lifespan, cosmological argument, and this is his discussion we're going to deal with from 1963. So the word cosmological, I want us to have a sense of the word first of all. A root word within the word cosmological is cosmos. And what do you think of when you think of the word cosmos? Like what is the cosmos? Do you have a view on that, or do you have a sense? You say space, Joseph, good. And that's fair. Whenever I ask people, that's the typical response. Same with you, Madison. But Amelie, I like the way you've put it, because space, let me put it this way. Are we part of the cosmos? Like, are we part of the cosmos too? Yes, we are. So sometimes when people say like space, they think of everything out there that you can see from the Earth looking out as a human subject. But in the objective sense, the planet Earth is also part of the cosmos, and all the objects on it are part of the cosmos too. So really the cosmos is just the whole physical universe. It's the complete entire universe. So It is the entire universe. Not just a part of it, not just one planet, not just one galaxy or solar system, but the whole entire thing. That is the cosmos, you know? So the cosmological argument now is this attempt to try and describe how could the universe have come to exist. It tries to prove the existence of God by questioning how we could ever have had the cosmos. Like what is the reason for the cosmos to exist? So just so you know, why is it called cosmological? Because it has to do with questions concerning the existence of the whole universe. Okay. Now, the author, Taylor, to present the argument in full detail, he starts off with a hypothetical scenario for us to kind of consider. And I think I mentioned it before, but it's coming back and it's going to be a frequent theme throughout the whole semester, that philosophy often asks us to contemplate hypothetical scenarios, thought experiments, in order to set the ground for an argument or to advance a point conceptually. And so the point of the example is not that it be realistic per se, but just that it allow our mind to focus on a key concept or point. So here's the hypothetical scenario, the thought experiment I want you to imagine. So imagine you're walking around in the woods, like, in a natural area, like a wooded type of setting. So that stick figure, it could be you. But you walk around, and as you're taking this walk in the woods, hiking around, you see a whole bunch of commonplace things that you would expect to see in the woods, like little, I don't know, woodland creatures, plant life, vegetation, and all the rest. But then you stumble upon something that's quite unusual to see in that place. And what it is it's a big sphere. Okay, my artistic skill is not amazing on this count, but I'm trying to show the glinting surface of the sphere where light shines off of one curved surface. So that's a sphere that you see there in the woods. And what do you think would be your initial kind of reaction to seeing that if you were on such a walk? What would be a commonplace human reaction to the sight of that sphere? What do you judge? Yeah, good, Forrest. Why is this here? A reaction of curiosity, because it's not usual to see it. It'd be a kind of, I think, strange person who saw the sphere in the woods walking and was like, yep, sphere in the woods, there's that, no problem, just keeps walking with no feeling of surprise or curiosity at all. So it would trigger like thoughts of curiosity and inquiry. You'd be wondering to yourself, I wonder how that thing got here, or what the background cause of it being there is. Okay? So the reason that he uses this example of the sphere is because seeing something unusual in a given place lights up these thoughts of like, where's it from and how did it get here? But when you see something in its everyday, usual, commonplace, that doesn't seem so strange and it doesn't lead to the same questions. So like, say you walked into a classroom, and you guys will walk into, I guess, our classroom on Monday. If you walk into the classroom, you're going to see, say, for example, desks and chairs. It's not unusual at all to see chairs in a classroom setting. So when you get in there, you probably don't see it, and you're like, whoa, like, where did this chair come from? Like, what is its ultimate origin, and how did it find its way to this classroom? Why don't you ask that question? It's just because it's something that is normal to see in that given place. So he picks an example of something that's unusual in its context, like a sphere in the woods. It's not a normal thing to see there. So that's why it would lead to these curious thoughts. But here's a point he makes next. When it comes to something that's in a common place, like you get to a parking lot, you see cars, or you get into a classroom, you see desks. When those examples are used, even though we don't have any kind of habit of asking where those things come from or what their ultimate origins are, question, could we still ask the question, like, where does the desk come from? Could we still ask the question, where does the car in the parking lot originate from? Could we or no? Yeah, we could still ask that question. We're not used to asking such questions because we just take it for granted when we see something in an ordinary place. When we see something in an out of place sort of placement, that leads to those questions, but when we see the everyday things, we don't. But we could still ask those questions, and that's the point here. Even about the everyday commonplace objects in an ordinary place, if we were curious enough, we could think those thoughts too. We could be like, well, where does, this marker come from in the beginning? Now, next point. The familiar objects, like a chair, a car in a parking lot, a marker on a table, we don't always know the origin story of each thing. right? We just know it's here and it exists. We don't necessarily know exactly like what assembly line it came off of, or what, you know, shipment company took it from point A to B to finally be in the place where you saw it. But even if we don't have all that background knowledge, we still know that it had to what? Even if we don't know where or how it came to exist, we certainly know that it had to have some what? It had to come from somewhere. That's right, Andrea. It had to have some cause. It had to have a cause, some background cause going back into time. And even if we don't know what that cause is, okay, we still know that it does have one. So like nobody looking at this marker would say, I don't know where it started off, so I just think it popped into reality out of nothingness. Nobody would say that, even though you're not aware of the ultimate origin story behind this marker. You know it has to have one because everything that exists seems to have a cause, all right? So that's the same kind of thought process that's involved in the sphere. You see it in the woods in our example. You don't know where it came from, but you know that it had to come from somewhere and that it has to have some cause, as unusual as it may be. So all of this lead up to this point has been to try and establish a principle that he thinks we can all agree with. And so what we've been building towards is the principle that I'm going to write down just now. And it's what's called the principle of sufficient reason. Okay? So the example of the sphere was just used to get our minds to focus on and appreciate this principle. Principle of sufficient reason. Okay, so the principle of sufficient reason just says this. I'll write it down and then I'll explain it if I can. So it just says, in the case of any positive truth, there is some cause or explanation for it. Principle of sufficient reason, definition. In the case of any positive truth, there is some cause or explanation for it. There is some sufficient, some good enough reason for the existence of any object or for any fact, for anything that's true. Now, I'll make sure it's clear enough to type in the chat as well. So, principle of sufficient reason. Okay. There you see that definition just appear in the chat. Principle of sufficient reason. In the case of any positive truth, there is some cause or explanation for it. In other words, everything has a cause. Anything that exists, anything that is true, there had to be a cause that caused it to be. Let me mention what he's saying with the term positive truth. I don't want that to confuse anybody. Okay, so a positive truth is just that something does exist, okay? So it's that something affirmatively, positively exists. A negative truth, by contrast, would be a fact that something does not exist. And what the claim of the principle is that if something exists affirmatively in the positive sense, then there must be some cause or explanation for it. But there does not necessarily have to be a cause or an explanation for a negative truth, that something does not exist. So like, okay, given the fact that this marker is an object that exists, the principle says there has to be what for it? The cause. Like it has to be started by something, caused by something. But like, okay, on this table right now, there's no porcupine on the table. That's true as well. But what kind of truth is that? The statement, the fact that there's no porcupine here. Just let me know. Sorry, I almost heard it. What was that?
A negative truth.
Negative truth, right? That's a negative truth. So it's true that there's no porcupine here, but that's a negative truth because it's not establishing the existence of something. It's establishing the non-existence of something. So given that there's a marker, yes, there has to be a cause for it. But given that there's no porcupine, I don't have to give a cause for that. I don't have to explain why isn't there a porcupine on the table. But when something exists, of course, there had to be a cause. Otherwise, it wouldn't have existed. Just as much as the marker has to have a cause or an explanation, so too do all existing things. The table that the marker is seated on, does it have to have an ultimate cause or explanation? Yes, because there's no way that something can exist if it wasn't caused to exist. So let me back up a bit and try and recap some of these points before we take it to the next step. Richard Taylor is trying to present to us the ancient classical argument for God's existence called the Cosmological Argument. Cosmological has to do with cosmos and the whole universe. And he starts with an example of a man or a woman, whoever, finding a sphere as they walk around in the woods. The unusual aspect of the sphere in the woods would lead a person to curious thoughts like, why is that here? Or how did that get here? And he mentions to us that although that would trigger these thoughts when the object is unusual, the same kind of thoughts could be stimulated even concerning something that's ordinary, like a marker as an example here. So the takeaway from those points is the principle of sufficient reason. He thinks that shows us that in the case where something's true, there had to be a cause for it or an explanation for it. Okay, so getting that principle on the table is key to the progression of his argument. So hopefully that's all clear and everything. If there's ever questions as I'm going through this, something you'd like me to expand on or repeat, please do let me know. But what we've got now is the principle of sufficient reason. So we're taking it now to another step. So the next step of his argument is to mention that there are two different types of truths, okay, guys? And this is a well-known concept in philosophy and logic, that there are two types of truths, which we call contingent truths, and on the other hand, necessary truths. So two types of truths. So there are contingent truths, and then necessary truths. Let's speak about the first type here, the contingent truths. Okay, so not to worry, Madison. Thank you. I'm glad that you're here. I know we all have Wi-Fi connection issues at times, so it's okay. But yeah, let me tell you what those words refer to. So a contingent truth is just this. It's something that is true, but it could have been false. It didn't need to be true. Like if things had played out differently, then this thing which is true would not have been. So these are things that are true, but could have been false. But could have been false. They could have possibly been false, even though that's not the way it turned out. Necessary truths, okay, these are things that are true, but unlike the contingent ones, necessary truths, the word kind of gives you the idea they are necessarily true, not just possibly true. So these are things that are true, and they could not even possibly be false. Okay, so things that are true and could not possibly be false. Not possible for the necessary truths to be false. Okay, so let's go ahead and start. I just want to ask you to supply, if you can help me out with some examples here of what kind of things can be contingent truths. So all you got to do right now is think for me of a fact, something that's true in this world, but you know, you can imagine a scenario counterfactually where it didn't play out and turn true. So what's something that's contingently true? And here's, another hint. It's almost everything. It's like every event that ever happens. So you say, Amelie, the internet exists. Good. The internet does exist, and you know that because we're here using it. But can you imagine a different course of world history where the internet was never developed? It didn't exist for a lot of human history. Suppose that we never evolved into a technological society and we just remained agrarian, living on farms and so forth with more pre-modern tools. then the internet might not ever have been created. And so though it exists, it's only contingent that it does. Very good. The Bengals going to the Super Bowl. Yes, the Bengals are going to the Super Bowl, but if the game had played out differently, then maybe they would have lost the game and they would not have gotten to the final championship round, you know? So that's another good example. And add a few more if you don't mind, just to kind of make sure we're all getting the picture here. It's stuff like that, though. Very good. France winning the 2018 World Cup. Yes, there you go. I was watching Croatia go against France in the 2018 World Cup. You know, my last name's a Croatian name, and I was at the Croatian Hall in San Pedro cheering them on, you know, when they beat London, but they lost it to France. Anyway, so I'm well acquainted with that fact. They did lose in the World Cup final, Croatia. France did win, but, you know, had things played out differently, maybe we would have had a different victor. So the outcome of a sporting match is always a good example because that's subject to chance. Getting an A on a test, that's another fine example. Say that you do well and you get an A on a test. It's possible that you might not have gotten that same grade if you didn't study the right way, or if, I don't know, you've been too sleepy, or if you missed the test altogether. Now, Joseph, you're going straight to the jugular, the universe existing. I know that you're ahead of the game a little with that, but that's where we are going here with this. But I'm building us up slowly, okay? So let's hold that thought.
I had absolutely no idea.
Oh, no, that's fine. But I mean, it's good, you know, because that's the big picture in the end. He's going to say, just a little spoiler alert, preview what we're going to do next. He's ultimately going to get to the claim that the universe is contingent. And if the universe is contingent, the principle of sufficient reason says it has to have a cause. So what could cause the universe? And that's getting us to God's existence. But just hold that thought for a moment. Now, let me ask, though, what are some things that could be called necessary truths? These are a little harder, perhaps, at first to give examples of, because they're a little weirder, because these are things that are not at all even capable of being false, not even in theory. So it's sometimes you got to think of stuff that's outside the realm of like physical events. You have to start talking about like conceptual stuff, mathematics and others. Okay, Kira, you say we breathe air. And yes, we breathe air, but I don't know. Is it at least theoretically possible that we could have evolved as a wholly different life form that subsists on like carbon dioxide or something like that? You know, there are tiny little microbial life forms that do. And so although we breathe air, I can imagine a far different track of evolution that would have led us to be different type of life forms, you know, breathing a different gas or a different type of compound. So breathing air, I know you think we have to breathe it to survive. Yes, that's necessary. But you really got to think outside the box on these necessary truths. Samuel, that's good. 1 + 1 = 2. That's a necessary truth for sure, because it's not like 99% of the time 1 + 1 = 2, and then sometimes it's deviant and it's just 3 or 4 or some other number. It's just a fact that's based on the definition of the numerals and the mathematical operation of addition. So 1 + 1 = 2 is just a bulletproof logical truth. It's necessarily true. Isabella, you say evolution, but no, because evolution is a process that plays out in the physical universe, and the whole physical universe doesn't even have to exist. So anything that happens in the universe can't be a necessary truth. The sun will rise tomorrow. You don't know that, Samuel. It might blow up tonight. So no, that's not necessarily true, and it could end up being false. Humans exist. This is not necessarily true either, because humans could never have evolved or never have come to exist. You know, humans haven't always existed. At the beginning of the universe, it's just matter, and it takes billions and billions of years, according to scientific accounts, for even tiny little life forms to form. 17 is a prime number. That's good, Amelie. Yes. Jimena, you say water, but there's no claim you make when you say water. Water what? You have to have a verb at a minimum for this to be a complete sentence. Sound waves or light exist? Well, again, no. The existence of any physical system whatsoever, including the whole universe itself, is contingent. So triangle has 3 sides. Very good. That's another good one. Wang Yung. A bachelor is unmarried. That's perfect. Yes. So definitional truths like the brown dog is brown, like that's necessarily true because it just says that the thing has the predicate that's part of its definition. That'd be like saying something self-identical, like A = A, and all statements of those forms are logical necessary truths. So mathematical truths, geometric truths, trigonometric truths are all going to be like necessary. Jimena, you say basically facts. Basically facts what? Because no, facts are not logical truths. They're not necessarily true because all the facts could have been different. Water is H2O. That, I guess, is fair because it's just a restatement of the definition of what the thing is. Kira, you say that is life is a real thing. I don't know what you mean because no, life didn't have to exist. Keep in mind that the whole universe's existence is also contingent. So all the things in the universe, life forms, planets, the sun, the stars, all of it's contingent. So for you to talk about necessary truths, it's got to be like a triangle has 3 sides. 2 + 2 is 4. 6 is a greater number than 3, you know, and stuff like that. It's not going to be like you were born, because your birth is also contingent. You know what I'm saying? Like, if your parents never met, you wouldn't be here in this class. You would never have been born. Okay. Andrea, is it something that equals to something? It's all these examples that I'm trying to point out. It's like math, true math statements. 1 + 1 = 2 or anything else, that's going to be a true logical truth. Because it's not like saying the weather. Like if I say it's going to rain tomorrow, that has a chance to be false. But 1 + 1 = 2 has no chance to be false. And when you say like life exists, it does exist, but it might not have existed if counterfactually the universe never came into being. So stuff like that's not necessarily true. Okay, so there's 2 types of truths. There's contingent and necessary. Amelie, you say if a self-defined truth is a necessary truth, brown dog is brown, then wouldn't the ontological argument use that when it says God is the greatest conceivable being? Yes, Amelie, actually. Anselm argues that God necessarily exists. And so in Anselm's view, the existence of God is a necessary truth on a par with 1 + 1 = 2. So yeah, I mean, according to the ontological argument, God is defined as a necessary being. But we'll get to that, actually. We'll touch on that again in a moment here. Okay, so let me just now take the lay of the land and tell you where we're at in the course of this argument. Richard Taylor presents us with the cosmological argument. It starts off, okay, Kira, other than mathematics, are there any other necessary truths? Well, we have geometry. All the points on the perimeter of a circle are equally distant from the radius. And that's something that's necessarily true just based on the geometric concept of a circle. All squares have 4 sides. So that's geometric rather than purely mathematical. You can have like trigonometric stuff. You can have logical truths too. But yeah, that's basically it. It's not going to be anything about space and time, because everything that's contained in space and time is contingent. Okay. Now, I was just doing my little summary. He starts by saying, consider an example where you see a sphere in the woods, something weird and unusual in the woods. You would then say to yourself, how did that get there? And this curious question is elicited because it's in its uncommon place. But even everyday things in a common place, the same questions could be generated simply by asking what their origin is. And we know that all things have an origin or cause if they exist because of the principle of sufficient reason, which says that everything which is true has to have a cause. Now, among these 2 types of truths, contingent and necessary, it is the contingent truths that the principle of sufficient reason pertains to. So if anything is true, but it could have been false, then certainly there has to be a cause that caused it to occur rather than not. So the little point that I want you to recognize here is that these types of truths, the contingent ones, are those that the principle of sufficient reason tells us has to have a cause or an explanation. Okay, so we are now going to advance the argument a little further. The next thing that the author says to us is that there is this one very big basic contingent truth that everybody knows is true. And once we see that it's contingent, it leads us towards the existence of God. And this contingent truth is that the universe exists. The cosmos, in other words, exists. The universe exists. Doesn't it exist? Of course. Look around. I mean, here you are. You're in it. So it's hard to deny that the universe exists. If you didn't think it existed, it'd be hard to understand what you really think is going on, right? So the universe exists. Can we agree? Probably. And if we think the universe exists, what kind of truth is this? Well, it would appear to be contingent, because although the universe exists, it seems at least possible that what? Let me see if anyone can finish that thought. You know, here's the universe. Yes, it exists for sure. But though it does, it doesn't seem impossible for it to have what?
Not existing.
Yeah, never to have existed in the first place, to have never existed. Now, that's an idea that's shared between science and religion, okay? So it doesn't really matter what side you're standing on. All sides agree that the universe has not always existed. If you believe in religion, then you believe in the creationist hypothesis, that God created the universe. But that's a decision of God, and he was not bound to make it. So if he didn't want to create the universe, then it never would have existed, and it's contingent on his will. If you believe in the Big Bang hypothesis, which is like the scientific consensus view, Still, that means the universe might not have existed if the Big Bang had never happened. And so all sides seem to have an agreement on that point, that though the universe exists, it's contingent that it does, and it might not have ever existed. So if the universe exists is contingent, then the principle of sufficient reason says that the universe has to have a what? Since it exists, there must be a what?
A cause?
A cause, right. Since it exists and since it's contingent, there has to be a cause or an explanation for it, okay? And now we're getting close to the end of the argument because there's only a few remaining steps. What could possibly be the cause of the whole universe, okay? That's our next question, and we're going to try and pursue that here. You guys know, right, that each one of us is contingent too. Like, you exist, and I'm very happy that you do. But you might not have existed yourself if the meeting of your parents never happened back in time, right? Because their conception is the cause of your existence. And just as their parents' conception is the cause of their existence. So human beings, objects, all of them all together are contingent. And it seems that the whole universe is as well. Now, some of you guys might say, I don't know, how could it be that the universe is contingent? Maybe the things in it are contingent, but wouldn't the whole thing be necessary? Well, he offers us this defense of the reasoning. It seems that every particular thing in the universe is contingent. So, you know, people, planets, solar systems, galaxies, it seems that there's nothing that you can point out in the universe that's not limited in time and space. Because, like, take an object as durable as the Earth. It still has a beginning and an end, and it doesn't occupy all of the space. And the same is true of all physical systems. They're not infinite in time. They're all temporary. And so if all the parts of the universe are temporary and contingent, then the argument says the whole system of all the parts should be contingent as well. Okay, so there has to be a cause of this universe then, as implied by the thought that it's contingent and by the intuition of the principle of sufficient reason. So now we got to ask this question, what could be a cause of the universe? So I'm just drawing the circle here, and I'm going to label it with the letter U. And that's going to stand for the universe. So just pretend that this diagram represents the entire physical universe and all the things within it. You know, the planet Earth, all the galaxies, you are somewhere in there. That's the cosmos. Okay. So one question. Could the universe cause itself to exist? Is that possible or is that impossible? What do you think if you just think about it for a minute? Now, these are big, deep questions. So I know it's like it hurts your mind a little to think about it, but that's philosophy. We can't do anything about that. That's just what it is. So could the universe cause itself to exist? What do you feel? What do you think? Could the universe be its own cause?
No.
Okay, no, you're saying. That's Emmy there? Yes. It seems like no, that it couldn't cause its own existence. And why not? Yeah, okay, good, Madison. Same kind of thing you're saying. If we're contingent, we can't make ourselves, then no. It should strike you as logically absurd to say that the universe can cause its own existence. And the reason is because for something to cause something, it has to already exist. You understand? So something can't already exist before itself to cause itself. That's just a logical absurdity. For example, can a person give birth to themselves? Of course not. It's just a bizarre thought process. It's impossible because you have to exist previously to be the cause of the effect. Okay? So clearly the universe cannot cause itself. This kind of concept of like the universe looping back and being its own cause, it's not possible. Because again, you would have to pre-exist yourself to be the cause of your own being. And that just seems to be a contradiction in terms. So one option has been closed off. The universe cannot be its own cause. Once again, the cause is prior to the effect. And so it can't both be the effect and the cause of itself. So this is not the answer about what causes the universe to exist. So let's try again. Maybe the universe is caused by something that's different from the universe. But what if this different thing is contingent? And that's why I'm labeling it with the letter C here. This is an arrow of causation. So from the cause to the effect. The universe, let's say, is the effect. This is the cause. So let's ask that question. Could the universe be caused by something which is contingent? What do you think, yay or nay? Could the universe be caused by something contingent? Okay.
Yes.
You're saying yes. And Andrea, you're saying yes. Brennan, you're saying no. Okay, so good. I'm seeing diversity of responses. And I just have to tell you the correct answer, at least from the author's view, is no. Now, Brennan and Jimena or anybody, can you fill us in? Why is that your intuition? That the universe can't be caused by something which is contingent? Why not? Because if so, what would be the problem?
It would be possible that the thing that's contingent couldn't have, like, it would need its own cause, and so it would continue to go back and forth. And also that it's possible that nothing was created at all if the cause was contingent.
Okay, very good. Right. So if the universe depends on something which depends on something else, because that's what contingent things are, they could have not existed. So if the universe is caused by something contingent, then based on the principle of sufficient reason, the cause of the universe would also have to have a what? Just let me hear that. If the cause of yeah, it would have to have its own cause. And so that would ping us to like another contingent cause. And if that thing is contingent, it goes back like dominoes falling towards another contingent cause. But if this keeps going on and on forever, it goes to infinity. And that is what they call an infinite regress. And an infinite regress is considered to be impossible. An infinite regress of causes is considered impossible by most who make the argument. So this doesn't work either. And let me just summarize again why not. Say the universe was caused by something that was contingent. Then by definition of being contingent, the cause of the universe would depend on another thing for its existence. And this would just go on and on and on to infinity without ever getting to the first cause, which is thought to be impossible. An infinite sequence of causes is logically absurd because it never starts anywhere. And so it leaves you wondering, how does the sequence exist in the first place if it does not have an initial member, if it doesn't have a first cause lying at the back at the beginning? So a sequence of infinite causes leading to our universe is just absurd. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't have any grounding. It doesn't start anywhere. So what he says then, before I move on, let me make one last point. So what would it be for the universe to be caused by something contingent? I don't know if you guys are like aware of like science fiction type stories, even like in cartoon stuff like Rick and Morty, like there'll be a situation where he has like a universe, Rick, this mad scientist guy, if you know the cartoon, and he's created it, right? So relative to that universe, he's like the creator God. But in the universe that this creator is in, he's been created by like another Rick in like a higher order of the multiverse. And if this just goes on forever, it's just Ricks to infinity, and you never get to like the ultimate creator and the ultimate cause of everything. So the principle of sufficient reason still doesn't have an answer, like what is the cause of all this stuff? It remains just sort of undefined. So that's the reason he thinks that this infinite regress situation is not a possibility, because it goes on forever and there's no ultimate origin. So then, if the universe cannot cause itself, and it also cannot be caused by something that is contingent, then instead, the only possibility for what causes the universe is that it's caused by something that's not contingent, but instead it's what? Let me see if you can judge. The ultimate cause of our universe, for it to be the first thing, it must not be dependent on anything else. And so that means it's not contingent, but instead it's what? Terminology. Think back to our meeting today. The cause of the universe would have to be a necessary being, a necessary truth. That's right. So I'm labeling that with N here. This is the picture, he says, that is the only one which could possibly make sense, because the universe depends on something for its existence because it is contingent. But when we look back at what the cause could be, saying it's self-caused is contradictory because it would have to exist before itself, which doesn't make sense. Saying it's caused by something contingent at least initially looks promising, but we see that that doesn't work out in the end because it implies an infinite regress of causes that leads us nowhere. And it certainly doesn't get back to the beginnings. So the only possible scenario that makes logical sense is that the contingent universe is caused by a necessary being. And what would that necessary being be? Now we can just say, the necessary being that causes the universe to exist is just thought to be what? God. That's right, God. Now, a necessary being is a being that's not contingent on anything else. It does not depend on anything else. So like me and you, we're contingent because if our parents did not meet, we wouldn't have been born. But God is described as a necessary being that all things depend on, but he does not depend on anything else. So like all the causes and all the facts and events, they're originated by the Creator God, but the Creator God does not have any cause behind him that he relies on to support his existence. He's just ultimate, he's eternal and essential, imperishable, has no beginning, no end, and he is the source from which the finite and contingent universe derives. Okay, and so that's why he thinks there has to be a God, because no other answer makes sense when you ask what could be the cause of the universe. So let me just go back through major steps of the argument one more time and try and summarize it in a way that makes sense. The cosmological argument tries to prove God exists. Taylor starts by giving an example of a person seeing a sphere in the forest. And by seeing that sphere, it lights up curiosity, like how did that get here? Why is that here? He mentions next that you could ask the same questions about commonplace things, even though we don't have a habit of doing that because our curiosity is usually triggered by things that are uncommon. But everything has to have a cause, whether it's usual or unusual. That's the takeaway. And this leads to the principle of sufficient reason. It just says that everything which exists has to have a cause. You ask, do I believe in God? I have a question coming from another message that asks, do I believe in God? I'm open to the possibility that God exists. I certainly think it's rational to believe in God, but I don't know. It's an open question to me, so I have a lot of time in life to still think about it. But the arguments are persuasive. Some of the criticisms are persuasive too, so I kind of feel like I have a balanced view. But I'll tell you this, if God does exist, I certainly believe that he would be fair and just. And so if you live a good, moral, righteous life, you're not going to be punished by God simply because you're undecided on the question of God's existence. So I feel like I'm good to go no matter what. But anyway, God is thought to be the necessary being which causes the universe. It can't be that the universe has no cause. It can't be that the universe is self-caused. And it also cannot be that it's caused by something which depends on another thing, because that simply goes back and back to infinity and does not ever give us an answer. Now, let me read some of his words, and you can hear his way of putting it. About the sphere thing. He says, suppose you were strolling in the woods, and in addition to the stick stones and other litter of the forest floor, you came upon some quite unusual object, like what you had never quite seen before, and would never expect to find in that place. Suppose, for example, that it's a large ball about your own height, perfectly smooth and transparent. You deem this puzzling and mysterious. But if you consider the matter, it is no more inherently mysterious that such a thing should exist than that anything else should exist. If you're quite used to finding such objects of various sizes around you most of the time, but had never seen an ordinary rock, then upon finding a large rock in the woods one day, you would be just as puzzled and mystified. This illustrates the fact that something that is mysterious ceases to seem so simply by its accustomed presence. It is strange indeed, for example, that the universe exists, yet few people are very often struck by this strangeness, but simply take it for granted. He says, suppose that you have found this ball and are mystified by it. Whatever else you might wonder about it, there's one thing you would never question. You would never say that it appeared by itself and that it owes its existence to nothing. You might not have the remotest idea whence and how it came to be there, but you would hardly doubt that there was an explanation. The idea that it might have come from nothing at all is one that few people would consider worthy of entertaining. And this illustrates a metaphysical belief that seems to be a part of reason itself. Let me continue down a little bit. The principle of sufficient reason is a very general principle, and it is best expressed by saying that in the case of any positive truth, there is some sufficient reason for it, something that makes it true. In short, there is some sort of explanation, known or unknown, for everything. Now he says some truths depend on something else, and they're called contingent, while others depend only on themselves, and are therefore called necessary. He says there is, for example, a reason why the stone on my window is warm is because the sun is shining upon it. This happens to be true, and it is contingent, and it depends on something other than itself. It is also true that all the points of the circle are equidistant from the center, but this truth depends upon nothing but itself. No matter what happens, nothing can make it false. Similarly, it is a truth, but it is a necessary one. Okay, now, the universe. It happens to be true that the universe exists, that there is a universe, and although no one ever supposes that this might not be so, there seems to be nothing contradictory about supposing that it had never existed. That no world should ever exist at all is perfectly comprehensible and expresses not the slightest absurdity. So going on a little further, he says on page 29, leading into 30, it would seem then that the world, in case it exists, and by the way, when he uses the word world, it's his phrase for the whole universe. Sometimes students have been confused reading world and thinking he's just talking about the planet Earth itself. But world is a generic phrase for the entire cosmos. So let me go on. It would seem then that the world, in case it exists, and this is beyond all doubt, is contingent, and therefore dependent upon something else other than itself for existence, if it depends on anything at all. And it must depend on something, because otherwise there would be no reason why it exists in the first place. Now, that upon which the universe depends must be something that either exists by its own nature or doesn't. If it does not exist by its own nature, so if it's contingent, then it in turn depends for its existence on something else, and so on. Now, we can say either of two things. Number one, that the world depends for its existence upon something else, which depends on another thing, and on to infinity, or that the universe depends or derives its existence from something that exists by its own nature, and that is accordingly eternal and imperishable, and is the creator of heaven and earth. The first of these alternatives is impossible, because it does not give a sufficient reason why anything should exist in the first place. Instead of giving a reason why the universe should exist, it begs off giving a reason. It explains what is dependent and perishable in terms of what is itself dependent and perishable, leaving us still without a reason why any of these things should exist at all. Ultimately, then, it would seem that the universe, the totality of all things, in case it exists, must depend upon something that is necessary and imperishable, and that exists not by depending on anything else, but by its own nature. Okay, so the contingent universe has to be grounded or caused by something which is not itself contingent. Because if it's just dependent things causing dependent things to infinity, then there's no ultimate explanation for how the first contingent thing came to exist or what its cause was. Like if you just say, well, I exist because my parents gave rise to me, and they exist because their parents gave rise to them, that's not going to give you the ultimate explanation of the origins of human life. And that's not going to give you the ultimate explanation of the origins of the universe, to say, well, this planet was caused by the accumulation of matter in this part of the cosmos, because that's going to depend upon background information and other facts that lead us to other contingencies. So the only thing that will stop this chain of causes from going on to infinity is if there's a first cause where the buck stops. And that first cause has to be a different kind of thing than all the things which issue from it. So all the dependent things stand in a causal relationship as the effect of something which is independent and which does not have anything else that it needs. So God would be thought of as that necessary being that cannot possibly not exist and that does not depend on any other force or object to give rise to it. And earlier a student asked, are there any necessary truths that are not mathematical? And I guess, as I was sort of mentioning then, that the existence of God by theists is argued to be a necessary truth. Like God's existence is something that is true and could not possibly be false, because if it had the quality of being contingent, then it couldn't serve as the explanation for our universe. Now, I've always thought that this was the most powerful argument for God's existence, because all that you really have to do to appreciate it is to agree that the universe exists, and to agree that whenever something exists, it has to have a cause. If those two ideas are assumed, then it's only a few steps from there to the idea that the universe has to have a cause. And the cause of the universe would have to be something very unique and special, because the universe is not just one thing, it's the totality of all things. So if it has a cause, it has to be something that's separate entirely from the system of the universe. And the only possibilities are that this separate cause of the universe is something itself which depends on other things, which leads us to an infinite regress, thought to be impossible. Or the cause that's separate from the universe, which it gives rise to it, is something necessary. And that's the conclusion that he thinks we're bound to come to. Now, there's like one other little subtlety in the essay that I probably will try to talk to you about a little bit on Monday when we come back to the physical classroom. But this was the majority of what I had intended for us today, just to really get a deep review of the cosmological argument. And next time when we come back on Monday to the classroom, we'll learn about another argument for God's existence called the argument from design. And then we'll start to hear about what are some objections to this one too. So that's going to be held off until the Monday. I have a question in the direct message. It says, how would the Big Bang Theory work under this argument? Would it mean that the Big Bang Theory is contingent? Interesting. Well, I mean, I think that the proponent of this argument believes in the creationist hypothesis, and therefore they would say that the Big Bang, if it happened, was done by the will of God, who decided at that point to cause the universe to inflate into existence and to start expanding when he generated like matter and light and all the stuff, let there be light, like you hear in the book of Genesis. So it's not really an argument that's based on the idea of a scientific explanation of the universe if by Big Bang you think of something which is contingent. What building is a classroom? Another question is being asked. Yeah, let me double check on it. It's, I believe, humanities, but I'll tell you exactly. No, it's EC032. So that's education classroom, and it's the basement level. You go in, well, you actually walk down a set of stairs to get to that room, and it's at the base of the EC building. You'll find it, no problem, but give yourself a little time to find it on the day. So I think the other question I got was whether the Big Bang would be contingent or not based on this argument. The argument only wants to supply reason to believe that God exists and that he's a necessary being. If the Big Bang happened and it's consistent with the argument, then the Big Bang would be something that happened because of the choice of the necessary being to issue the universe. Now, if you believe the Big Bang is contingent and it might not have happened, then the author would say it must depend on something else, because something can't happen when there's no cause whatsoever as long as it's contingent. So it's definitely a little bit perplexing, right? How could there be an idea of a Big Bang that's contingent, consistent with the assumptions of the cosmological argument? The cosmological argument says that the cause of the universe is something that's not contingent, not something that's a matter of chance or probability, but something necessary. So I guess then maybe the Big Bang would either be something that happens necessarily, or it is the result of a choice made by a necessary being. That's what the cosmological argument would have us believe. Okay, so you guys feel like that's at least somewhat clear? I know these are heady ideas, and these are things that are really deep and mind-boggling, but I'm trying to just bring it down to earth for you as well as I can. There's only so much I can do on that, but I do my best. So another attempt to prove God exists. Notice the differences between this and the ontological argument. The ontological argument was based on definitions and concepts, like the idea of God as the greatest conceivable being, and part of that greatness is to really exist. So if we agree with the definition, he's got to exist. This argument's not so much based on definitions and concepts of the meaning of God, but rather just the idea of cause and effect, and the observation that whatever is effect has to have a cause that started it, at least if the example is something contingent. Since the universe and all the things within it appear to be contingent, they would seem to have a cause, just as much as a person who lives today would have to have parents, because you just don't exist necessarily, but only because you depend on something to cause your existence. So if the universe is like a contingent being on a par with us, then it has to have some kind of background cause as well. And thinking that it causes itself is a non-starter, just as much as a person giving birth to themselves is a logical absurdity. Thinking that it's caused by something contingent doesn't work, because it only kicks the can down the road, and then we have to repeat the question, well, what caused that contingent thing? And if it goes on to infinity, we still don't really have any ultimate origins. So the only thing that can serve as the ultimate foundation and ground of the contingent universe is a cause that is not itself contingent. So why are we here, and why does all the things exist? Because a necessary being caused it to exist, and that's the argument. So I'm going to let you guys go for the moment, and you can go back to your notes in the book. I know sometimes when you reread these articles after you hear the lecture, it might come into clearer focus for you, so I invite you to maybe scan through some of the passages, and we'll recap it again on Monday when we come back. But this is just our first taste of that. So let me hear from you guys that you're ready to go, if you want to say goodbye or sign off, And then once you do that, I'll close the stream and I'll see you back on Monday. No need for me to send you any links this weekend. It's going to be physical class on Monday. But I'll see you there. Make sure you got your mask and that you have all your papers and other things in order. And I'll be happy to see you guys on Monday, okay? Take it easy then and have a great weekend. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. See you soon.